everybody, and welcome to part one of our 10th week lecture. We're going to talk about 19th century colonialism as it affects Africa and the Ottoman Empire, and how those two places interact with Europeans, or rather, how Europeans interact with those two places. Let's start off with terms. We've got quite a few of them, mostly because I would normally explain some of these terms in person, but since I'm not in person, I'm going to go ahead and get your ears primed to hear these terms later on in the lecture. The first one shows social Darwinism. It's this pseudoscientific political ideology that corrupts the findings of Charles Darwin and his Origin of Species. Essentially, it is this kind of truncation of Darwin's findings that comes to the conclusion that the world is best inhabited by those who are strongest, or survival of the fittest. And of course, who should be at the top of this fittest chain but white people? It was essentially used as a kind of a rhetorical shortcut, a kind of justification for political conservative movements, ones that were anti-reform. It was also used to justify imperialism because obviously those less developed people need to be exploited because that's their role in life. It also is used to justify racism and discourage intervention and any kind of reform. Colonialism in this context, in the 19th century context, is the practice of dominating other countries through usually military might, but also through economic pressure or through threat of violence or conquest. So some areas are not actually conquered, they're not actually invaded, but they acquiesce nonetheless because of that looming threat. So it's the difference between punching somebody and threatening to punch somebody. Colonized territories are then usually exploited for raw resources, labor, and geopolitical position. The Berlin Conference is a roundtable discussion that lasts for several months between 1884 and 1885, that is attended by 13 European powers and the United States. And essentially, they're coming up with pragmatic ways of dividing up Africa in order to avoid any kind of conflict that might arise. This is largely because of some economic realities and also some political tensions that are arising in the European continent in the late 19th century. Participants essentially agreed to establish colonies through mutual agreement that local chieftains or princes or kings or whatever would be consulted, and that there would be this kind of treaty, and the Europeans would come in and essentially modernize these regions of Africa. And in exchange, the Europeans would develop infrastructure, they would end slavery, and particularly the slave trade within Africa, which still existed even in the late 19th century, and also to kind of integrate Africa into the worldwide stage commercially, so to speak. The second page of our terms starts with divide and rule. This is a policy of maintaining control over a populace by setting the populace against each other, by creating some kind of division, whether artificial, such as maybe socioeconomic or linguistic or tribal, or even some that are a little bit more obvious, like racial attributions or maybe differences in dress or differences in custom. And the idea behind this is that the populace are so busy fighting each other over these nonsense differences that they never realize that they're being exploited. A concentration camp is essentially a detention facility where large numbers of people, usually some kind of political dissident or an ethnic minority, are imprisoned. The point of this concentration camp is a purposeful harming of this captive populace, usually housing them in facilities that are that would not be deemed acceptable by the wider populace. So they don't have adequate food or water, sanitation, basic human needs like the ability to bathe or the ability to defecate or urinate without exposing others to those waste products. It can also encompass those facilities that were used or designed to torture people until death, that were used as a kind of forced or enslaved labor, and also to dissuade further rebellion in that oppressed minority or in that political portion of the society, or to prevent anybody from opposing the ruling body. These concentration camps do take place largely constructed by Europeans, and it happens with disturbing regularity at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th and unfortunately 21st century. I'm also going to talk a little bit, not so much about a term, and this is not really an official term, the three keys of colonialism, but your book does touch on these three key developments that were important to the exploitation of Africa as a whole. The first is near instantaneous communication through the telegraph lines, military might that was augmented by the Maxim gun and other so-called machine guns, and European resistance to disease through medical advances such as inoculation, vaccination, and of course quinine. Your book touches on those a little bit, and we'll talk about those in context as we move along. So Africa and colonization between the 1860s and the 1910s takes on a different characteristic than European interactions with Africans had been for several hundred years. Prior to about 1860 ballpark, we're going to ballpark that about 1860s, European interaction with Africans consisted largely of a kind of cooperative, semi-cooperative relationship with ruling warlords or tribal chieftains or kings of one sort or another to basically siphon off excess population to one degree or another. Now, there were occasionally, especially as we get into the 19th century, there were occasionally raids by Europeans who were capturing African populaces and transporting them across the seas. Part of the struggle in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, about relations with Africa was this issue of the international slave trade. Now, I had mentioned in a previous lecture that by about 1803, 1807, most European countries had abolished the international slave trade, with the exception of Portugal and Spain. European reformers had been not terribly successful in suppressing this international trade. They had proposed this idea, especially in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, of replacing international slave trade, the trade of human flesh, with the trade in products that would be grown or created in Africa and then exported to the wider world, and that could be just as lucrative and obviously much less morally damning than trading in human flesh. Well, they didn't really do very well other than end the official international slave trade. It continued for several decades. There's a movie called Amistad that touches upon this as well. And there has been kind of a little bit of success of replacing slaves with a more lucrative trade, particularly in palm oil. Your text covers this, what the use of palm oil was. But the reality was is that major shifts didn't happen until about the 1860s when there's geopolitical realities become much more different than they had before. First, the American Civil War and other anti-slavery movements, particularly the Mexican War of Independence that abolished slavery well before 1860, cuts off a target of slaves. The Americans had long since done away with international slave and relying upon internal growth of slaves up until about 1860. But once slavery is officially abolished in the United States, that again cuts off a kind of black market, for lack of a better term, for international slaves. It's not until 1880s that we get the real, true, and full abolishment of slavery in the New World, when Brazil finally ends its use of slave labor. But the trend is heading towards less and less need for international slave trade. Another factor that plays in this is the Industrial Revolution. As machines replace muscle power, it becomes um, more and more viable to replace plantation labor, for example, with machine labor. So you don't need many hands to plow the fields, for example. A machine can do the same work of, say, maybe 10 or 20 people with the same amount of effort, with only overseeing of one person. And of course, Europeans were mostly removed from the African continent, at least deep penetration other than coastal fortresses and occasional raids inwards, because of the presence of certain diseases, particularly the prevalence of malaria, but other diseases as well, such as the sleeping sickness and dengue fever and other diseases that Europeans really didn't have very much resistance to, and so often got very sick and often died relatively quickly after being exposed to. So what changed? Well, as I mentioned before, the industrialization of Europe plays a huge part in why the relationship between Europeans and Africa changes. I kind of tongue-in-cheek here put the idea of feeding the machine, but that is absolutely true. European societies had been using wood for many centuries to construct ships, and into the late 1900s, wood was used for construction of ships continuously. Less and less so as we get closer and closer to the 20th century, of course, but still there is the need for wood. Well, Africa has lots of timber. Africa has lots of unexploited timber, particularly hardwoods, tropical hardwoods, things like teak, which don't rot very easily, especially in damp conditions. That becomes very essential to the use, or for the use in the Industrial Revolution, and in producing products like railroad ties, telephone poles, telegraph poles, furniture, and other objects that are necessary for the Industrial Revolution. But also palm oil, as I mentioned before. Palm oil was used as a kind of lubricant for those machines. I mentioned in a previous lecture that whales had been used and whale blubber had been used in the late 18th century and early 19th century. By the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, whales are not an infinite resource, and they're dying off very quickly. Or I should say, humans are killing them off very quickly, which means there's less and less oil, which means that the machines won't run as well. So we need an alternate. And in the mid 19th century, palm oil seems like it's one of the oils that could probably replace whale oil. Later on in the early 20th century, very, very late 19th century, things like petroleum become useful as the ability to extract and refine petroleum becomes more and more viable. There's also some economic changes. There's a world economic issue. Uh, First off, though, Britain had been the kind of workshop to the world, producing about 1 in 3 products by machine between 1750 and about 1850. By 1860, things are changing, and Britain is losing its edge. It goes from 33% in, say, 1870 to about 17% of the world's products in 1900. That still seems like a lot, but that's a precipitous drop over that few decades. Why? Because you've got a lot more competitors. You've got Germany, you've got the United States, France, Russia. All these others are competing for the same market with the same kind of products, with the same kinds of technology. So there's this kind of need for expansion into colonial spaces to find markets, to find new materials, to find new people to incorporate into the empire, and theoretically become a stimulus to the economy. There is, of course, as I mentioned before, a depression. There is a global depression that actually lasts for about 4 or 5 years. It's not quite the Great Depression, but it is extremely worrying, especially for developed nations. And so a lot of these developed nations embark upon some protectionist trade policies. They begin to raise tariffs on imported goods, which hurts Britain. They begin to exclusively deal with their own colonial holdings, which again hurts Britain. It also hurts the other Europeans. I'm just picking on Britain, for example. And this leads to a need for new markets and a need for new materials. There needs to be something to feed the machine. So why Africa? Well, it's also industrial needs. Africa, as I mentioned before, has these vast forests full of raw timber, which are either useful for fuel, they're useful for construction, it's useful for making products out of them, for example. But also Africa has deep reserves of relatively unexploited raw materials, things like gold, diamonds. It's a very good environment for growing rubber, although rubber trees initially start in Southeast Asia. There's not a lot of land comparatively to Africa. There's a lot more population density in Asia. So a lot of these rubber trees are imported to Africa and to a lesser degree to the Western Hemisphere in tropical and subtropical regions. So rubber is necessary for gaskets, for tires, for belts, for any bits and pieces of machinery that you want to cushion and that you want to last for a while. And rubber is still used even to this day because of its unique properties of dissipating heat, of being resistant to wear and tear. And then, of course, the aforementioned palm oil. But also, Africa becomes another kind of breadbasket for these empires, for France, for Belgium, for the Netherlands, for Germany, to import food, foods such as potatoes and peanuts. Peanuts are a very cheap food with high protein content, lots of oils, lots of minerals, lots of vitamins that are necessary for a working poor family to continue working, even though they are poor. But also, Africa offers a kind of feather in the cap for these imperial needs. Um, the imperial ambitions elsewhere, such as India and China, uh, necessitate ships stopping off in Africa to refuel, to take on water, to take on coal, which is feeding a lot of these steamships that are necessary for 19th century, late 19th century travel. Also, a good place to repair along the coastlines, raw materials again to repair. But also, there's this kind of need to hold more and more colonies. This kind of you're not a real big player on the European stage unless you have a lot of colonies. And the more colonies you have, the more powerful you have. And this is not just a kind of like, well, I have it, therefore I'm a better country. It's also populous to draw upon in the case of war. England, for example, relatively small landmass when compared to its European rivals, even though it does have an increasing uh, populace throughout the 19th century, as I covered in the lecture last week, last Monday. Even though we have an increasing population in England, there is still the need for other bodies, for colonial holdings, Africans, Indians, New Zealanders, and Australians will all play a huge role in the upcoming wars of the 20th century. And without those manpower reserves, it is unlikely that England could have fared as relatively well as it did in the two world wars. So there is a little bit of truth to that. You need the people to assist you with the wars in order to essentially man the armies and do the things that are necessary to project power. But also, as I noted before, travel is very difficult. It is almost impossible to get from Europe to anywhere else in the world, well, at least anywhere in Asia, without going past Africa at some point. If, for example, you are traveling from England to Australia and you need to make that journey, look at the routes that are available to you. You have to head south along the Atlantic and then around the tip of Africa to be able to eventually get to Australia. And the same is true coming back, even though prevailing winds make it easier to continue to go eastward and then kind of loop up through the Atlantic again. And this is true for France, for the United States, for Russia, for any European power or Western power or developed power, rather, that wants to access Asian markets or Asian goods. Africa comes into play sooner or later. Thus, we get the need to acquire territory within Africa. Travel becomes extremely regular as the 19th century goes on. Uh, we'll talk about this in the next lecture on Wednesday, a little bit about what's happening in Egypt and in the Middle East, particularly shortcuts to this travel route. But throughout most of the 19th century, the need to stop off in African ports of call is incredibly pressing. So in order to have the best chance of controlling these necessary ports, many countries, such as, again, to pick on England, uh, need to establish essentially corridors of power. And that is true for England in this case. If you look to the right, all those pink territories are either colonies of or submissive to England's geopolitical needs in the 19th century. And that's largely thanks to a policy that was articulated by a British adventurer and businessman by the name of Cecil Rhodes, who you may have noticed at the very beginning of the PowerPoint slide. He's here again on the left. He has his left foot standing in Cairo, his right foot standing in Cape Town, and between his hands strings a telegraph line. Telegraph lines become incredibly important because they convey messages at near instantaneous speeds, and in this case, traverse an entire continent much faster than any human could possibly hope to travel. So now we've established this idea, this need for establishing colonial presences in Africa. But Africa not only represents opportunity, Africa represents a potential for disaster. As European nations seek to undercut each other, remember that balance of power we talked about the other week, where you cannot be any stronger than your rivals or where you should be as strong as your rivals. Well, if one rival has a nice corridor going from Cairo in the north all the way to Cape Town in the south, you need to undercut them. You need to cut them off somewhere. Maybe get some territory in the middle of that so that they can't have that corridor. So what happens if, for example, France decides that it wants to take away some territory from Britain? Is Britain going to let that happen? Probably not. What will happen then? Well, then a war will break out. Maybe just on the continent, but there's also a possibility, as in the 7 Years' War in the 1700s, that this war will spill over to a global conflict, or maybe even, gasp, a European conflict. So the Berlin Conference was called in 1884 by Otto von Bismarck, initially to address the acquisition of territory in the Congo and this kind of dispute between France, Belgium, and Germany about who has what rights where. And so it expanded slowly and eventually became the big Berlin Conference that was called in 1884. And it served many purposes. The biggest of which, at least from the German point of view, is to establish Germany as a world-class power. Ostensibly, it was to better Africa, but in reality, as this political cartoon on the left of the Time shows, it's actually just dividing up the cake that is Africa so that everybody gets a slice of that cake, that tasty, tasty cake. So what was the idea? What was it sold? How was this built? Well, you can imagine how this would play in the newspapers in the United States or in France if there was a cabal of international people that were seeking to take land away from other people in order to enrich themselves. That might not play so well. So how was it spun? What was it sold as? Well, it was sold initially as an African-European partnership. Within the Berlin Conference was this language that there would be an alliance between African societies and European societies, that they would be governed by treaties, and that they would respect the sovereignty of the African people. And to make it even better, it was sold as this kind of progressivist ideal, much in the way that those settlement houses had sought to advocate for the working poor. So too this Berlin Conference and this new neo-colonialism was sold as a kind of holy crusade, if it were. And so we have these 3C mission, the mission of spreading Christianity as a counter to what was sometimes characterized as the tribalism of Africa, the worship of pagan gods, but in reality it was also to counter other versions of Christianity, such as Roman Catholicism or Coptic Christian, or to counter Islam, which had been making inroads into sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the countryside, throughout the early 1800s. Also to bring commerce to the people of Africa. And finally, this is my favorite loaded term, to bring civilization to the people of Africa. And here we see this kind of play of social Darwinism, that it is an acknowledgement somehow, or at least a buy into the belief that Europeans are somehow mentally or morally or physically or intellectually superior than other people. And so by bringing civilization, quote unquote, civilization to Africa, you're actually improving the people of Africa, helping them uh, shake off that benighted past. And so it became this the colonization of Africa was seen as a noble sacrifice, or what Rudyard Kipling calls the white man's burden. Now, Rudyard Kipling penned this poem called White Man's Burden as an ode to colonialism. And it was his celebration of the United States becoming a world power when it invaded the Philippines and it invaded Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic as part of the Spanish-American War, or the culmination of the Spanish-American War. And it casts the colonizing mission as kind of a noble sacrifice, that white people are giving up oh so much in order to go forth and sacrifice and bring these benefits of modern society to non-white people. It also infers, well, not so much infers, because there's a line in which they say that the native soul, which is half devil, half child, is basically enlightened. So being non-white is automatically equated with being bad or innately evil. So that's how it was sold to progressives, and many progressives saw this as a necessary mission. In fact, there were many American evangelicals, for example, who had participated in the abolition of slavery, who also participated in missionary work to Africa and the recolonization of Africa by the establishment of Liberia and sending freed African slaves back to Africa. for example. What colonialism really was, the partnerships were rarely equal. And when I say rarely, I mean almost never equal. And they were usually extremely cruel. Some really bad examples are the Belgian Congo. We see a Congolese man here who is missing his right hand. He was punished for not providing enough gold in a day, and so his overseers just lopped his hand off as a punishment. Sometimes people could have their hands lopped off or their feet lopped off, or in some cases they could be just executed because they refused to work for the white overseers who ran the mines or the plantation or the railroads or whatever. But we also see that in the Boer War, and I'll touch on what the Boer War is in just a little bit. Essentially, colonialism eschews these Enlightenment ideas of freedom. It eschews this veneer of a noble sacrifice in the three C's colonialism of bringing civilization. And in reality, it's a conquest. And in that conquest, might makes right. And so we see, even though there are robust movements for rights and for freedom within the home states of European nations like France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, the United Kingdom. Even though we see that, this kind of celebration of freedom, what we see in overseas holdings is authoritarian rule. That is a demonstrably uncaring governance of native people. In the Belgian Congo, quinine allows for European administrators to stay nearly indefinitely in the country with relative resistance to malaria. There is not complete immunity, that is impossible, but it makes them very much resistant to, or makes the malaria, if it is contracted, much shorter in duration and much less severe in its symptoms. And this is all the Belgian go into the Congo largely to exploit natural resources from day one. From day one, it is to extract as many natural resources as possible. The exploitation of elephants drives certain species of elephants in the Congo to near extinction in order to recoup ivory. Um, Later on, it becomes gold and gems. And what we see here is the use of a chicote. Chicote is a whip made from the hide of a hippopotamus. And oftentimes people were beaten for the slightest of infractions. And there are many cases in the Belgian Congo of people literally being beaten to death one after another using this whip that would literally flay their flesh. Now, of course, you're thinking, well, there's Africans holding this man's hand. There's an African administering the whip. Why are Africans doing this? Well, that's because of divide and rule. A perfect example in the Belgian Congo is the Belgians really exploited these tribal differences between these two native tribes within the Congo, the Tutsi and the Hutus. One was held up as superior to the other because they seemed slightly more Caucasian. Their nose wasn't nearly as broad. They typically tended towards lighter skin than the other. They typically tended towards more reddish hair rather than black hair. And so they were often given a more favored position, still oppressed, but given a little bit of a leg up, given minor administrative posts, made into police officers, made into local military, often allowed to become doctors and lawyers, whereas the other was often barred from this. And towards the end of Belgian rule in the Congo, which lasted until the 1960s, there were identity cards that identified not only what race you were, but where you came from and your lineage, so that you couldn't get away with trying to pass as somebody else, where you were repressed because your parents were repressed or your grandparents were repressed. And so you see people who are more than willing to acquiesce to the demands of the Congo, to the demands of the Belgian leadership, rather than rebel against it, because they're given at least some advantage over maybe these other more oppressed minorities. The Boer War is probably another horrific example of European colonization in Africa. Uh, Surprisingly enough, it happens against other Europeans. See, the Boer War, Boer coming from the word for farmer or a settler, that's a Dutch word, a kind of corruption of a Dutch word. And the settlers who had lived there since about the 1700s resented British rule that had started in about the early 1800s, actually about 1809. And so over the past several decades, they had withdrawn from British rule by moving further and further north and establishing their own independent states, one called the Transvaal, the other one called the Free Orange State. Well, word gets out that within these territories there are vast resources of diamonds and gold, and that those diamonds and gold were being sold to Germans and to the Portuguese, not to the British, who were obviously surrounding them. So this concept of your territory not being completely sovereign to the British was very upsetting, and so the British attempted to put down the Boer, these Dutch descendants. And the Dutch descendants began to resist, and initially they were very successful, but the British resorted to some extremely harsh measures to counter the resistance. They engaged in scorched earth, where they would burn farms and houses and businesses that belonged to either Boer fighters or sympathizers. So it made it very difficult for the Boer to continue to fight because they didn't have anywhere to import food from, for example. They also instituted the use of concentration camps. Boer resistance fighters were identified, or suspected resistance fighters were identified, and their families, their wives, their children were rounded up by the British and put into concentration camps, camps that were often denied access to doctors, running water, adequate food, and of course, sanitation. The majority of people who died in the Boer War were not fighters. They weren't even the resistance Boer commandos. They were the women and children, the wives and children of the Boer inhabitants. Of course, the British began to use the Maxim gun, a machine gun that could allow firing upwards of 600 rounds per minute. So a vast devastation upon the mounted cavalry of the Boer. And of course, the utilization of telegraph communication to coordinate attacks at near instantaneous speed, something that the Boer themselves did not have. So what we have is authoritarian rule emerging in Africa, and often the victims were ordinary people living there, whether it was the women and children of the Boer, or it was the people who refused to work, who had their hands lopped off or their feet cut off. Authoritarian rule was the rule of the day in Africa by Europeans. So, a result of colonialism by 1913, rhetorically, it was sold as bringing progress, bringing Christianity, bringing commerce, bringing civilization to a dark continent. And they meant dark both in the terms of skin tone, but also dark in terms of mysterious or unknown. And the idea was to develop Africa to meet the modern world, to give it a new infrastructure, to give it telegraphs and railroads and roads and new ports and access to a wider world of commerce. to bring manufacturing, to allow people the fruits of their labor, and to give them all jobs, jobs that they could then use to purchase new manufactured goods as they are part of the happy empire. The reality is, however, it didn't bring progress so much as it brought law and order over anybody else's wishes. So this leads to an authoritarian rule with harsh punishments and a quiescent populace, people too afraid to act up or afraid to stand up for their rights. And of course, instead of developing Africa to meet the modern world, instead all roads lead to, well, anywhere else. Europe to Asia to America. Infrastructure is aimed largely at export and rarely for inter-territory movement. Manual labor is relied upon because it is cheap and, as we noticed before, easy to get a hold of. It also leads to deep racial segregation. The apartheid in South Africa that lasts into the 1990s was a product of this divide and rule strategy to basically make up to the Boer in South Africa. The English allowed for a kind of pseudo-slavery that allowed for black populaces who had lived in the territory for thousands of years to be relegated to demi-slavery roles within the society. Their movement was curtailed. Their ability to educate themselves was non-existent. And so this led to underdeveloped economies, economies that couldn't produce things that were more valuable than the raw materials. Think of it this way. What's more valuable, a handful of wheat or a can of beer? What's more valuable, a raw lump of gold or a gold necklace made out of that lump? What's more valuable, a tree or a chair? What do you pay more for? And so we have, at the end, by the time we get to the 20th century, this deep exploitation of Africa as a continent, this deep division within Africa that talks a good game, but the reality is vastly different. And when it finally comes to light, is deeply shocking to the people of Europe and to the Americas. All right, guys, that is it for this particular lecture. Don't forget to check out lecture 2 about the Ottoman Empire.